from AIAA here today to moderate this panel. Tom is at the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, or AIAA, where he is the Managing Director for Content Development. Prior to joining the staff at AIAA, he was at NASA for 32 years, where he worked on both aeronautics and space programs at the Glenn Research Center and then at NASA headquarters. Please welcome Tom Irvine.
Is it just the, oh, I got it. Okay. Thanks, Stephanie. So I should have some charts that'll come up in a second, but as Stephanie just mentioned, I was at NASA for 32 years, and in 2004, my career took an odd turn. I ended up at NASA headquarters. And so I was there for 12 years, and for many of those 12 years, I consider myself to be an aerospace engineer because for many of the 12 years, I was actually the Deputy Associate Administrator for Aeronautics Research. And every NASA administrator that was there while I was there, and there were 3 of them, invariably at some point asked me, so I'm running a $16, $17, $18 billion government agency. Why do so many, and 97% of that is not related to aeronautics, only 3% is. Why do so many people want to talk to me about aeronautics? It was really a pretty simple answer, depending on how you do the math. The direct and indirect benefit to the nation of our aviation system is around $1 trillion. And if you took the NASA space budget, took the Air Force space budget, what we know of it and what we don't know of it, throw on the commercial launch segment, you get to about $100 million. So it's about a 10-to-1 difference in direct or indirect benefit. And I always explained that was why there's so much interest in aeronautics. But a really interesting thing in reflection upon that was a lot of the people talking to the administrator about aeronautics were from the legacy companies, either in large commercial transport primarily, the big system integrators or the tier 1, 2 OEMs, because so much of the R&D money in the industry flowed through NASA or initiated with NASA, and they obviously wanted some part of that. The part of the industry that was not coming to talk to the administrator about aeronautics necessarily is the part of the industry that's maybe not as well capitalized but very energetic, and that's the part that's revolutionizing aviation, the aviation part of aerospace anyway, and that's the drone industry and the people using machine intelligence in those drones to really change a lot of what we're doing. And I tell you that story only because I think it's relevant to what we're trying to do at AIAA in terms of bringing the commercialization of space community together. Some background, and the reason why we feel an organization like AIAA can contribute to the conversation is it's an economy it's becoming increasingly complex, and it's an ecosystem of public and private sector actors, high-tech innovation, and dynamic growth. And I think this morning, I think the theme of this conference is convergence, and maybe it was Deborah or one of the other speakers talked about sort of that intersection of maybe legacy companies with new space companies. And I think that statement says this, and there's some statistics there about the size of the space industry, both in the U.S. and then globally. And interestingly, in 2015, I think there was $1.8 billion of venture capital invested in space ventures, and that was actually more in that 1 year than that had been attracted in the previous 15 years combined. So there's clearly analogous or akin to what's happening in aviation on the drone side. If you follow the energy and you follow the enthusiasm, it definitely resides in a burgeoning part of the industry. So in September, at our last Space Forum in Long Beach, we actually convened an executive summit. And importantly, we had about 60 or 70 executives from both public and private organizations, and a few from academia. And importantly, the meeting was not for attribution. There's something called Chatham House rules. It's from Britain. It's probably part of their socio-political system, where participants can take what's said outside of the room and talk about it, but they can't necessarily attribute to whom, or they can't contribute, or they can't attribute it to any individual that may have participated. And that seemed to have really helped the sort of openness of this summit in particular. As a way of introduction, one thing that I think we started with this belief that private-public partnerships are really a viable mechanism for developing technologies and infrastructure to support this commercialization of space. And I think this morning, we did talk about infrastructure, and we talked about applications. But an appropriate government role, no matter what example you look back at, whether it's in the transportation sector or the energy sector or some services sectors, an appropriate government role is always an investment in infrastructure first. Stability, and I think most companies that are in business that have any kind of dealings or relationship with regulatory government agencies like the EPA don't necessarily bemoan environmental regulation. What they bemoan is uncertainty, because they can't do any forecasting if there's a lot of uncertainty in regulations. And so stability, we think, is an important consideration moving forward. Federal policy can provide guidance to concentrate efforts across all sectors. Yesterday, if you were here at the kickoff, Dennis Stone made an observation that I think was pretty eye-opening for all of us in the room, and that is awareness of using microgravity in a lot of other industry sectors: biotech, agribusiness, pharma, nanotechnology. He mentioned quite a few more. His point is that's almost virtually unknown. People in that industry don't recognize the potential of microgravity. And so there is a role for government, and there is a role for federal policy in order to inform those type of industries that there is this opportunity and availability. Government can take specific and immediate steps to encourage more favorable market conditions. The government as a potential customer cannot be the sole customer, and economic incentives should be considered to attract investment. So we've all heard about the examples of where government investment resulted in something positive in terms of either business or economic activity, whether it's railroads, whether it's highways, whether it's electrification, or whether it's the ARPA investment in what eventually became the internet. And probably something like that could help jumpstart a lot of activity and commercialization of space. Leveraging all available resources, including industry trade associations in the policy-making process. Okay, that may have been a little gratuitous. The workshop was put on by AIAA, and so the participants thought that across the board, everyone could help in terms of informing policy and the decision makers in the country. And then developing an integrated value proposition is crucial to communicating the benefits and revenue of potential for space-based activities. And there's a website and a link, and if you don't have a chance to write that down, just slip me a business card and I'll provide the link, although I think you can find it pretty readily just by Googling Executive Space Summit. You'll find both the AIAA link and an Aviation Week link. So we have a couple people here. They both talked yesterday who were summit participants, Bruce Pittman and Jeff Matthews. And if they can join me up on stage, we'll talk a little bit about their perspective of how things transpired. So Bruce, to my right here, is currently working as a contractor at the NASA Ames Research Center in Silicon Valley. He's the chief systems engineer in the NASA Space Portal Office, and in this position he supports NASA headquarters on programs ranging from orbital applications of the International Space Station and other orbiting commercial facilities to low-cost, reliable access to space, reusable space infrastructure, as well as space cislunar commercialization. And Jeff, who's now to my immediate left, is a media consultant with 15 years of experience in finance, enterprise architecture, corporate strategy, business development, and venture capital in sectors such as energy, aerospace, defense, cybersecurity, architecture, and mobile applications, so he clearly needs a few more interests.
Just a few.
He's a specialist leader for Detroit, or for Deloitte, not Detroit, Deloitte, where he provides subject matter experts on the commercial space market, and he has an association with Space Frontier Foundation as well. So Bruce, I'd like to start with you. I'm going to paraphrase Sandy Magnus, who's the executive director of AIAA. She summed up the summit by saying, after 60 years of government investment and activity in space, we have reached the point where the private sector, leveraging knowledge and technology, has become motivated to develop economic activity in LEO. Even those with only a casual interest in space recognize the changes and evolution that is occurring. And so the first question is, reflecting on what you said yesterday, which said if you want to see a paradigm shift from the inside, just look at where we're at right now. So is Sandy correct in saying this? And if she is, there are obviously some enablers and some inhibitors to this economic activity to which she referred. So I'll start with you.
So first of all, I'd never disagree with Sandy. So I would say, yeah, she is correct, and my whole take on this is it's about time. You know, one of the things isn't that what we're seeing now is that it's happening. Why is it happening? One of the questions is, why did it take so long? I mean, if you look at the progression of air traffic from the Wright brothers to the development of the DC-1, which led to the DC-3. So between 1903 and 1935, 1936, you saw a tremendous development in technology and infrastructure and all that. And then the Second World War kicked in and all that, to your point about aviation. The cost of rockets is, you know, and the technology that we're using is pretty much what we've used for the last half century. And so you haven't seen a whole lot of that until you saw some new people that, you know, we again come back to that term disruption. So you see some people coming in and disrupting the thing. And one of the things that these guys did, in addition to being very bright and very aggressive and everything, the other thing that really helped was that they were really rich. And so that they could come to the table with resources and money rather than having to convince somebody else that they were right. They said, well, I've got enough money, I can try this and see if it works. And I'm willing to take those risks. And sometimes they were wrong, like Andy Beal, and sometimes they were right like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. So, you know, just because you're rich doesn't mean that you're omnipotent. So some of these people succeed and some of them didn't. But now I think we've gotten, you know, back to Clayton Christensen, this irrefutable counterexample that when people said, oh, you got to do it this way or that'll never work, you can't do that. Well, these guys come in and said, well, you know, you said that couldn't, you had to do it this way. This guy did it a different way and it seemed to work. So I think those are the kinds of things that are happening here. And it is a little bit spooky. I mean, because the fundamental rules of the game are changing, and that's discombobulating pretty much everybody, especially the established players. And so I think this is one of the roles that the AIAA is playing, is trying to get both of the traditional space and the emerging space to learn from each other and cooperate together. There's clearly something that the emerging space folks can learn from the traditional space and vice versa. So I chair the commercial space group for the AIAA, and that's part of what my organization, my team, is supposed to be doing, is helping with that process of you know, taking the past and the future and trying to get them to work together.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. So Jeff, if the fundamental rules are changing, you participated in the summit last year, and you sent me a note, or maybe it was through Stephanie, a week or two ago, that said this was a really cool event. And I'm assuming that there's a connection between the fundamental rules changing and that summit having been been a pretty cool event. So what made it cool, or what was so rich about the discussion that really maybe helped or is helping to make a difference?
So from an industry association perspective, it was the best event I went to last year, hands down, by far. I think what really helped were the non-attribution rules, the fact that we could have open and honest conversations. I, like Bruce, was on the business imperative side. I was actually there not representing the Space Frontier Foundation, but representing an early stage startup called Finsophy. If you've heard of them, they're the ones that are trying to do a certificate of deposit or savings CD that you can redeem for a ticket to space, hopefully in 10 to 30 years. But we really just at our table, I thought, worked through a lot of issues in terms of the funding area. We were able to actually address some of the topics that we've all wanted to address, but have never had the forum in which to engage each other in. And I will say, for some of the people that I sat at my table, these were people that I had shaken their hands in passing, but had never had good quality conversations with, mostly time and schedule. These are people that I still talk to on a regular basis because of that event and the shared values that we brought to the table. So I just really thought it was a great avenue to talk about what we really wanted to do to change the industry.
Yeah, thanks. One thing that I did hear is a lot of times executives, regardless of their organization, they're invited to events like this or a space forum. They tend to have the opportunity to talk at people and maybe talk to a few after they talk, but not to spend 3/4 of a day in pretty rich dialogue. So I appreciate that comment. So one of the things that we had a lunchtime speaker, his name was Bob Rogers. He came from the entertainment industry, and he helped us understand how, as an industry, we tell our story and what we do well and what we do, frankly, that makes it boring and maybe a little off-putting. And I think part of that is we need to talk to non-traditional or non-aerospace businesses who either are interested and maybe don't know it, or maybe they have an inkling that they are interested in the advantages of doing research and development in low Earth orbit and or doing business in space. And certainly an organization like CASIS, I think, is chartered to do that for the ISS. But how do we entice these non-traditional or non-aerospace businesses to become interested in maybe first doing R&D and then later extending what they're doing into true businesses that are generating either products or services that are saleable or that people are interested in? And Jeff,
Sure. I'd like to touch on one thing that you said about getting non-traditional players interested in this. Even outside of the traditional R&D funders, I think that there is a massive paradigm shift about who wants to talk about space. So shout out to Space Games Federation and the Space Cat. They actually got me in touch with somebody last year that I never would have dreamed about talking about space with, the tangibility of space, the fact that this group would even be interested in space. And they are, I won't mention them by name, but they're absolutely somebody that you would never equate with this industry in a very long time. And they weren't the only ones. They really were trying to lead in their sector, but they were not the only people that said, hey, I see what Elon's doing, I see what Jeff Bezos is doing, I see there's value in this. So in terms of getting more people engaged and the non-traditional people, I think we do have to refine the value proposition, and that was one of the big takeaways that was up on the slides a few minutes ago. I also think we have to do a good job of educating the non-traditional people about what is capable in LEO, what the timeframes are, and how they can participate now, whether it's a terrestrial buildup or a direct utilization of space. But I think the time is right to have those conversations and just make sure that they know that it's tangible. This isn't the dream of 20 years away. This is the dream of 2, 3, 4. It might even be the dream of 18 months. Mm-hmm. We can do this, we can do it now, or we can do it in a reasonable time frame, so let's start developing towards that.
So Bruce, as the chief engineer for the NASA Space Portal, if I understand the charter or the responsibility of the Space Portal, you actually have some of that responsibility that Jeff was just talking about in terms of going out and convincing people this is either ISS or even beyond ISS is a good place to look at to do R&D or to do business. So how do you go about when you approach people or they approach you? What's the conversation like?
So I want to give a shout out to my one of my colleagues, Dr. Owana Kazmuta, because she really led the way on this. and she's been very successful at it. So one of the things is she is a voracious consumer of information. So she went out and she did her homework. So she went through and reviewed every single experiment, literally, that had been done on the space station and the space shuttle since the beginning of the program, and started looking for the examples, the really things that were interesting. And one of the things is talk about hiding your light under a bushel barrel. There is, everybody's been bad-mouthing the space station for years, decades now. It's a waste of time and everything. There's been some really amazing things that have come out of the space station and the microgravity program, both on the shuttle and the station. We've just done a really terrible job of telling that story. I remember about 10 years ago, I was at a big NASA meeting in Orlando, and we had Jim Cameron, the movie producer there, and he said, I have two pieces of advice for NASA. He says, you need to tell your story better. And then he looked thoughtful and he said, and you need a better story to tell. And so I think now we've got that better story to tell. There's actually some really neat things going, as to Jeff's point, that we're things are moving faster. It's not like, and maybe 35 years we'll be, to step one. No, things are moving really quickly, and you can see the pace of activity going up. But we still have that other part of telling our story better. And so part of this is listening. Value proposition is one thing, but we translate that into WIFM. What's in it for them? What's in it for me? And looking for that intersection. It's not just about what you want, but the people that you're trying to get interested in. How is this going to affect them? How's this going to affect their lives? How's this going to affect their children and the country and the world? And I think if you can make those connections and show the linkage there in a time frame that's reasonable, then I think that's how you get it. But one of the key things that I think we need to do a better, two pieces of advice, guys, everybody out there. One is de-jargon your talks. I mean, one of the things, if you've ever tried to have a conversation with somebody that's outside of our industry, when you come to a meeting like this, it's almost incomprehensible because we use so many acronyms. The dreaded TLA, 3-letter acronym. So that's one of the things. And then the other thing that we've got to do a better job of is listening. So rather than going into talk mode and always doing that, you have to listen to what the other people are saying and where they're coming from, and then try to find that middle ground.
Jeff, part of in part of that listening or part of that discussion with others, we obviously have to talk about what would otherwise be considered some pretty dry topics: financial interests of investors or entrepreneurs, risk of investment, revenue, growth potential, things like that. So how do you do this but not make it sound like you're describing a mutual fund prospectus?
I actually wrote a prospectus earlier this year, so they are dry and very boring. But the good news is at least gave us the background information to assure that there really was something there. In my opinion, if you're out talking finance and people are listening to you talk about finance, they're going to be expecting the traditional financial talk. I think the change in how you approach it is why the time is right now. It's not that, again, back to what I said a few seconds ago, it's not driving for 20 years away. It's not driving for 35 years away. It's not, this is the dream of the future of our next generation. It's, we can invest and drive significant change today that is starting to drive value to not only you, but the greater US economy, the greater global economy. And we can have an impact now similar to how other earlier stage industries were 10 years ago. It's viable, we can do it, and the time is right.
So I want to, Stephanie just gave me the high sign, so I want to ask both of you something that's not at all scripted. I didn't send this to you ahead of time, but reflecting on the lightning talks that we just heard, one of the things that I recall from a lot of the tables at the summit last year was, this is something we could use a killer app because that'll just generate tons of interest and that'll snowball into larger and bigger things. Is broadband services that killer app that we're all looking for, or is there something else that you've been thinking about or that you've been hearing that you would describe as maybe that so-called killer app that'll really change things and set this industry in motion.
So I think there's a lot of great things out there. There's on-orbit computing, there's laser comm, there's some great technologies. I think we need to figure out what the technology is that we need to invest in to create the app store to enable the remainder of those emerging technologies to happen. And it's not what we've got now. We are driving towards it, in my opinion. But once the ability to create the app store is there, or at least to enable those other applications, I think then you'll start to see the really killer apps once we've got that infrastructure in place.
Yeah. Bruce?
So, I've been looking for that killer app for like 30 years, It's a little bit elusive. And I think it's kind of like, the analogy I would use is like an anchor store in a big mall. It's an important piece of the puzzle, but it's just one of the pieces there. It's maybe what gets a lot of people to show up, but it's the other stores around it. So I think that, and again, I'll give a shout out to Dennis Stone. He's the one that started articulating this, about this ecosystem, that we need to develop here as a space ecosystem. And that goes back to Mary Lynn's quote, those network of interactions, everything. To me, that's the description of an ecosystem. So to me, that's what we need to develop in space. And one positive note here, I will note, if you look at some of the latest NASA authorizations and legislation that came out of Congress, there was one line in there that came out of some of the stuff that's happened in the last couple of years, and they put in there that one of the goals for NASA and the space program now should be the development of a thriving space economy. So I thought that was a really positive statement, that it's not just about science, it's not just about knowledge, it's not just about exploration, but finally economics are entering into this, and people are beginning to realize, hey, there's money to be made here. You better start paying attention, which goes back to the other Bruce's comments yesterday about this commodities exchange. So I think that the next 5, 10, 15 years are going to be really exciting, and I'm really envious of the young people out there in the audience for just getting to be at the front end of this. So I think it's going to be exciting.
Well, that's an upbeat note to end on. So I want to thank you both for your participation last year in the summit. We do plan to repeat it again this September in Orlando. We're going to focus on that policy stability and government incentives and partnerships. We hope both of you can participate again. And thank you for joining me today to explain your perspectives from the summit from last year. Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Bye.